And I just want to open and thank them. And I think most specifically, and I'll turn it over to the chief in a second, and I think he'll turn it over to the judge, and then Captain Fitzgerald can kind of really fill in a lot of what the hard work of the Bridgeport Police Department over months now has I think brought what I think we'd hope at least some closure to this as a criminal matter. It was referred by the probate court with some, I don't know if it's 100 or 130 families that were impacted in this, with potentially relatives in this cemetery. And so we're here, I think, to answer any questions. But really, I want to, at least on behalf of all those, I know that I've gotten calls, our office has gotten calls, on behalf of all those that are either affected or have been interested in this as a very important matter, to thank the Bridgeport Police Department, Detective Bureau, Captain, you, and Chief, obviously, for your leadership. And I know you've made this a priority with all the priorities that you have, and it's greatly appreciated. So why don't I turn it over to you, and then maybe the judge, and then we give it to.
I just want to say thank you, and I want to welcome everybody to the Bridgeport Police Department. Yes, this case was referred by probate judge Paul Ganem. Some time ago, I reviewed the case, and it took me maybe 15 minutes. I then called Captain Fitzgerald. We spoke, and we opened a criminal investigation into this case. I always say this because I believe it. My detectives are second to none. These men and women of this department, they're dedicated, and they came to a great conclusion. And I'll let Captain Fitzgerald talk about it, but let me tell you, these guys, thank you. Second to none.
Thank you.
Your Honor.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Just very briefly, this matter came to the court's attention because of Miss Jensen, who has a loved one that was buried there. She noticed some disturbing things. We held some hearings, and during the course of the hearings, the court had learned that if there was certain information that went missing, a lot of this would not come to light fully. And with that, we suspended the hearings back in April, referred it over to the police department to investigate it and to obtain whatever records they could for the benefit of the families that have loved ones in Park Cemetery. And the department has investigated it, seized the records they needed to do, has done a terrific job. Absolutely outstanding job, and hopefully bring a close to what occurred there. It was, it's a tragedy. It's the sanctity of our loved ones in their graves should never be disturbed in such a way. It was disturbing for the court. It was disturbing for loved ones. I understand there's over 130 of them. Chief, I thank you. I thank your department. They did terrific work, and can't do more to commend them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
As the captain comes up, I want to say, Captain, I know in the detectives, I don't know if you're going to speak. It doesn't sound like you want to, but that's okay. But they did share with me, certainly one who knows about this but wasn't intimately involved in what had been discovered. But as the captain will tell you, these were the burial plots, the graves of some over 100 years old, of veterans, and individuals that may have been, I don't know if you call it a pauper's grave, or people that didn't have enough money maybe to have a more sophisticated burial. And so there was an impact on people, and our department, I think, again, through your leadership, Chief and Captain, and through our Detective Bureau, has done an outstanding job. So why don't you, you're so well at kind of taking us all through it. Why don't you do that?
That's great. So I'll give you a brief synopsis of how our investigation proceeded. After we got the criminal complaint, our detectives made a site visit. And what we learned right from the beginning is that this part of the cemetery that they were continuing to work in was unlike other cemeteries that most of us have seen. It was up in the back in the northeast corner of the cemetery, abutted by residential areas that are separated from this by wooden picket fences. And what we found right away was a lot of disturbed dirt, garbage, headstones that were overturned, and as our detectives started to look closer, we found bone fragments that were later confirmed to be human remains, and pieces of old caskets that date back over 100 years. Some pieces of wood, some pieces of metal hardware that were disturbed. So after the site survey and speaking with some workers at the cemetery, we drafted a search warrant, and we served the search warrant on the cemetery and seized a lot of documents, including plot maps and financial documents. And our detectives spent many hours analyzing all of them, trying to reference new grave sites that we had observed with old grave sites that were documented on these plot maps. And what we found is that there was intermingling of grave sites. We were finding grave sites from some soldiers that were close to 100 years, and in some cases over 100 years old, mixed in with new burial plots from 2011 on?
Yes, sir.
2011, 2012 on. And we spoke with a lot of experts. We spoke with the Connecticut Cemetery Association. Our detectives spoke with other cemetery operators. Spoke with the State Medical Examiner's Office. We had an archaeologist on scene. And then more recently, we utilized ground penetrating radar to get a better picture of exactly what was below the surface. And the conclusion that we came up with is that the cemetery was intentionally disturbing grave sites so that they could replot new graves, either adjacent to or in some cases overlapping existing grave sites. So with that information, Detective Bean and Cintron authored and applied for an arrest warrant, and we arrested Dale LaPrade this morning, charging her with disturbing cemeteries.
Can we get a mug shot of Dale?
I believe that's going out through the PIO, Teron Jones.
What was her position?
She was the owner-operator. Yeah.
Was there a reason? I mean, just financial, just to maximize profit here, or was it just
So we're not exactly sure a motive right now, and that's still part of our continuing investigation as we cull through more documents and examine more documents. Certainly she was trying to keep the cemetery afloat, pay workers, pay herself, and you know, it's kind of uncharted territory for us. We hadn't worked a case like this before, so we had to do a lot of research on our own and speak with a lot of people to figure out what the state laws were and what was a customary practice for a cemetery and what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. And that's where we saw a lot of improprieties in how she was operating.
What specifically, based on your research, is not allowed that she did?
So you cannot disturb a grave site to replot a new grave in that area, which we found that. We found some evidence of stacking grave sites, so one grave site on top of another grave site, disturbing grave sites by moving gravestones and not putting them back where they're supposed to be. There's specific rules and procedures on how that's supposed to be accomplished.
And is there anyone who monitors that overseas on
so-
the state level, or?
No, there's not. So each cemetery is supposed to be governed by a cemetery board. The last board for this cemetery had been dissolved well over 20 years ago. So the owner-operator was operating on her own without any oversight.
and criminally, what is this person? Is this a felony? Is this?
Yeah, this one was a
Class C felony.
Class C felony. Yeah,
And what's the potential jail time there?
that would be up to the court. I'm not exactly sure what the sentence parameters are. Yeah.
But she could serve time in prison.
It's a felony, so
Yes,
potentially yes.
up to 10 years,
Yeah.
I think.
Mr. Mayor, your reaction just on a person, the judge kind of gave his thoughts, but if you could step up and maybe
Yeah, I mean,
you mentioned these are some.
as it came to light, at least for me, it was a little bit, you know, the captain touched on it. This is not something you hear about every day. And it came to light through the court, through the probate court. And so I'm glad to a certain extent that there's closure to this. Certainly it's still unsettling that this could happen, that you could see people with kind of a blatant disregard for the deceased and the impact it would have on families even generations later. And coupled with the fact that I'm told that a number of these were even veterans, Civil War veterans. I mean, you know, when you get to the level of understanding, it's nothing you ever want to see happen. Hopefully there's a message that goes out, certainly to the individual that has been arrested, but to anyone else who has this type of authority over cemeteries. Maybe we don't think about them except for at the times when, unfortunately, we're dealing with a bereavement. But that there's a sanctity to it that needs to be respected. And if not, at least in Bridgeport, The Bridgeport Police Department's not going to, and the Bridgeport Probate Court, and anyone else who's in authority is not going to stand for what's happened here.
What will happen to all the remains that were discovered in the woods, and what can families expect if they worry about a loved one?
Sure, and I think that's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer for it, but I would suspect between the police department and the probate court, these are matters that, and again, I would have to say, and anybody can jump in, this is not something that I don't think, there's a lot of people, not just in Bridgeport and Connecticut or elsewhere, that have had to deal with.
Right.
And, you know, the cap, it's but the captain did inform me that, and we talked about this for a little bit, and Judge, you can take it over in a second. You know, different jurisdictions, there are some states where the laws are different. But in Connecticut, there isn't 100 years where you can disturb it. And certainly, I don't think even in those states, and I haven't researched it, you can disturb it the way that this was done. We can't share with you, but you know, the disturbances were, if I could, bones are laying on the ground, headstones are just blatantly tossed, and these grave sites are just disregarded with lack of respect. Your Honor?
I'll try and address a little bit. So there's going to have to be a little bit of a procedure, and it is uncharted territory. We've got graves that are disturbed. During the course of my hearings, there was literally bags of bones that were picked up by witnesses and brought in and brought to the attention of the court. Those are going to have to be identified. There's going to have to be probably custody of those remains and reinterment somewhere and in some mechanism that is respectful of these souls that have passed. You know, it's a little bit uncharted. We'll get it organized, and we will figure it out, but it's going to be a little bit work in progress.
And if somebody suspects that their loved one's remains have been tampered with, what should they do?
They should probably contact the probate court. We'll try and give some direction as to how we're going to proceed. It's a tough situation. It really is. Identifying the remains of who is going to be challenging, to say the least. So.
And so you mentioned 2011, the captain did. Is this how far back you think this has been dating that this has been going on for?
Yes.
And up until the point of, up until this year, when this came to your attention, do you think it was still going on?
It was still going on as recently as several weeks ago until the Superior Court stepped in and took the authority away from Ms. LaPrade to operate.
I mean, she knew she was being investigated, though, right?
Yes.
And she was still doing it?
Yes.
What does that tell you about this person you're dealing with?
Again, I can't speak to her motives, and you know, there was certainly criminal negligence there, and that's what we acted on, and I just don't know what her motivation was. Yeah.
I'm sure you probably can't disclose this, but is she mentally sound?
Yes.
Is the cemetery maxed out in the sense that they're out of space, or this was just convenient to do it this way?
No, there's still some space that remains in the cemetery, and there was just a better and more professional way of doing things, and they just didn't do that. I mean, we found other areas where it was just very sloppy groundskeeping, things that we didn't find necessarily that were criminal in nature. But it just, you know, if you paid a visit to the site, you would see that it doesn't look like a cemetery that you would normally see or expect.
We're looking for pictures of some of the conditions that you described. Can those be released?
So any photographs that we took, they're exhibits for evidence, so we can't release them to the media. I know there's been several other local media outlets that have taken photographs. Perhaps they would share them.
Who shared them?
Other media outlets in the area have posted a lot of photographs and taken photographs, like the Connecticut Post. And
oh, you're saying perhaps they would share with
yeah,
us?
perhaps they would share, but we can't share any photos.
Right.
Right. Thanks. We're good?
Thank you very much.
Can we talk about the Grinch that stole Christmas?
We did that
We
yesterday.
can actually. I mean, we'll do it. Chief, come on up.
Go ahead.
Paul, you want to come up? Yes, I think the good news is, because of the help of media outlets such as yourself, so many have stepped up. Local attorneys, Wonderland of Ice, the City of Bridgeport, Channel 12, all have participated in. I think we're at a point where, and I haven't confirmed this with the Reverend, we're at a point